When I started my first role in J&J, there were people who did not understand Middle East, and they did not know that Middle East is actually a bunch of 17 different countries. I had to actually, probably give geography lessons in some specific instances, saying that, these are 17 different countries and these are different governments, and, different regulators. So Middle East has so much diversity within itself. They behave very differently from each other. So you can't really treat them as the same. It actually combines developed world economies with emerging markets complexities.
We are so excited this morning to welcome Himani to the She Supply Chains podcast. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Katie.
So we are going to jump right in. So we always start off with wanting to learn a little bit more about who you are, both personally and professionally.
Yeah, thank you, Courtney. So, clearly, I think let me start with personal first. That's the easy bit. I'm a wife, a mom to two teenagers. I'm originally from India, but I live and work in Dubai now. We have been in the Middle East for about 7 years plus, and this is home for all practical purposes for now. So, the roots continue to be in India, but my kids don't remember much about India. So, this is where we are. And professionally, so, it's been about more than 20 plus years, almost 25 years of supply chain experience end to end. I think the two things that would stand out about my experience is I have worked across all parts of supply chain. So I have done planning, I've done logistics, I've run a manufacturing unit, and I have run a procurement function with a large spend in terms of operational areas across all of them. And that's an interesting part. The other is that I'm also a consultant now, so I get to see the other part of supply chain where I look at transformation from an external lens, and that brings a slightly different perspective to me, which frankly I did not have until a few years back.
Okay, so you've got this incredible experience all over. I have so many questions for you. I know like what life in Dubai is like right now with like all the crazy happening in the Middle East.
Yeah.
I also want to know like you've worked across all these places in supply chain. Literally, and we usually some of our guests are like one area, that's it, maybe two, but like you've truly worked in every single part of our supply chain. How did you know the supply chain was for you? Like when was it an aha moment? Was it a build over time? Like how did you know that you wanted to be in supply chain?
So I'll tell you, when I was finishing my engineering, and I trained as an electronics engineer initially, and I did that because my dad was an engineer, and he was my role model, like many of us. And when I was finishing it, I realized that this is not the place I want to be. So either I go technical or I go the management way, and I realized that technical is not something that really excites me. Management was something that was quite interesting for me to look at. At the same time, I was very keen to stay in touch with my engineering roots. And I realized that, some of the areas that I'm really focused on or I'm good at, my strengths are technical analysis and, things like that. So I decided to take supply chain as my management, in 25 years back. No, 27 years back, this was not the in thing, I can tell you. I was only the fifth batch of, MBA grad in supply chain from the institute that I went to. And there were no women there. We were three of us in the whole campus.
Wow.
Yes. I remember when my father, he took me to drop me to the college. He realized that there were just three of us, and he was quite concerned. And he said, maybe we should just go back. And
Oh.
I was like, no, let's give it a try, and let's do this thing. So the MBA was good, but I think for me, when I started my first job, and I joined as a management trainee in an Indian FMCG company. It's called Dabur. It's a personal product company, and in India, as a management trainee, when you join the company, you typically do a rotation. So in the first year, you don't really do a job; you do a rotation. So you spend like 3 months in sales, 3 months in marketing, a few weeks in HR and other functions, and then you come back to your base function. And I think it was during that rotation when I realized that I think I have the best job in the world.
Oh,
Uh,
I love that. I have a question,
same.
Himani.
Go ahead, yeah.
How, and as Katie talked about, for some of us, I think it was hard to know when and how to get those experiences across the
Mhm.
different kind of sub functions. And so, how do those come to be? Because I'm like, that's like a really great breadth of experience. And I don't think it was easy to know how to navigate that. And almost what I hear from people, and I think I felt this, Katie, I think a little bit you too, is when you do try to jump from operations to procurement, sometimes it's hard to be considered as a candidate when you're not, have the skill set in that, and then you try to go to planning, and I was interested to hear your journey there.
No, that is very interesting, Courtney. Absolutely. And I can tell you that I had my fair share of challenges in that. But at the same time, I think I was really blessed with some great sponsorship and leaders in my, various organizations that I worked with, which really helped me move across. I think it was, as I said, it was early on I realized that my strength is width and not depth as much.
Mm.
And once I realized it and I became aware of it, the focus was always to see how I can leverage that. So, just like most of the people, I started with planning and then moved on to logistics, which was a relatively easy bit. And then I went back to planning. And after that, when I was kind of finishing my planning stint, and this was the time when I was in Castrol, I got some really great sponsorship from some senior leaders, and they were keen for me to try out manufacturing. And I can tell you that I had my concerns at that time. I was almost middle management, and I was like, who would take me in, put me in a manufacturing unit? I'm not, And they said, no, 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 we think you can do well, and this is great, and it was great. So they sponsored me into a manufacturing role. I had my share of slips and trips, but eventually it came out to be one of the best experiences that I had. 2 years on the manufacturing floor, leading a factory of about 200 odd workmen, and being I was the operations head, and I think that was one of the most rewarding experiences I had. I can tell you, in those days things were not so easy. When I landed into the factory, they didn't have a women's washroom.
Mm.
And there was a separate washroom, and they locked it and gave me the key, and they said, Himani, this is the ladies washroom. And learning to wear safety shoes and then moving around, and starting my day at like 4:30, traveling 1 hour, to reach the factory because it was outside the city, and so on and so forth. And then when I came back from the manufacturing setup, I came back into logistics once again. And by then, I had done logistics and manufacturing and planning, and I was really, really keen to, complete my supply chain experience. And I said, okay, my next role should be procurement. And incidentally, I was just finishing my logistics role when procurement role opened up. And I was like, okay, I would like to throw my hat in. And just at that time, something happened, and my logistics team got a bit destabilized. There were a lot of resignations and some other internal changes, because of which we were not able to do that. So I withdrew my application.
Mm.
It was an internal role. So, I withdrew my application and I said, sorry, this is not the time for me to leave my function. Let me just, and I did that for 1 year. And in that 1 year, they made 3 different offers. Nobody accepted. It took me 1 year to, stabilize my function. And by then, the role was open again.
Oh, it was meant to be. They were just waiting for
It
you.
was literally meant to be. So that 1 year, they didn't have anyone. And then I was ready, and my function was ready, and I had a good successor, for my logistics function. And I said, now is the time. And I started talking to them once again, and it just happened. It worked out. It was like destiny.
I love that. Okay, fast forward to today now. You're out and about. You meet somebody new, maybe at the school, out at dinner, and they ask you like what you do. How do you describe what you do today?
Oh, it's fun, right? I think long time back, it was very tough to explain what supply chain is. But thanks to COVID and the various geopolitical situations, I think that has become so much easier now. Um, so I often go to my children's school. They do this careers day, and I speak to these young students in high school, who have to choose a career, and I kind of talk to them about what supply chain is about and all that stuff. But I think if I was to just, tell them in short, I would say supply chain is like the art of moving things from people who have them to people who want them, and being absolutely inaccurate along the way.
That's super clear. I like that.
It is.
It's very visual. Okay, Hamani, as we talked, your career has spanned a lot of critical leadership roles across very diverse geographies, including India, wider Asia Pacific, Middle East. What are some of the core cultural or operational nuances that you've encountered when you're aligning stakeholders across, over 17 different markets. And, as you did this during your time at BP, can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so no, I think Gurneet especially, I used to come to Dubai quite often when I was in BP. At one point in time when I was doing my procurement role, I was also responsible for Middle East, and I used to come to Dubai very often, practically every other month because I had a team here. But after I moved here, I realized that there is so much more to working in the Middle East than what I had experienced when I was, kind of just moving in and out. It was very, very different. So I think if I was to look at Middle East, I would say, and I would compare it to India. I think those are the two areas that I have, geographies I've spent most of my time in, with some amount of time in, wider Asia Pacific. Middle East is completely driven by relationships. It's trust first and then business.
Mm.
India is not like that. Middle East is a very, very high touch region. You need to constantly talk. You need to constantly, focus on, building that. India is very ad hoc, short term thinking. We have what we call as jugaad mentality. I don't know if you've heard the word. Somehow
I've heard
do it.
Jagar. Yes.
Somehow do it. So we are
Yes.
always
Sometimes it's
doing
it's
this.
used in a way of like you're scrappy and you've figured it out. And other ways you're like, that is just some duct tape holding that together. They're like,
Literally like that. I think it's a very short term thinking because there's just so much competition, so much pressure constantly that
Mhm.
you're constantly thinking, okay, let me close this and move to the next one. It's not ideal, but it works in that context.
It works. It works.
So, it kind of works it. If I was to look at Southeast, North Asia kind of a thing, I think it's all about harmony and hierarchy. I think that's what the entire focus is on. How do you make sure that there are not too much confrontations, and, hierarchy is definitely the key. Not so much, in India and the Middle East. I think those would be some of the small cultural nuances that I have, faced. Of course, there is no one size kind of fits all approach. In terms of operations, if I was to say, I would say India has the scale. It is scale. 1.4 billion people. There is so much to do at all points in time, so much going on constantly. So there is a huge amount of scale. Middle East doesn't have the scale, but it has the chaos.
Mm.
It's so volatile. Anything that happens anywhere around the world, it will impact Middle East. 85% of what we consume in the Middle East is imported.
Yeah.
Mm.
It's a huge number. It doesn't matter what you do wherever. If there's war in Ukraine, we will not get grains. If there's war somewhere, anything is stopped anywhere, we will not get something. Something will get impacted. So Middle East gets impacted with anything and everything. So it's really very, very volatile. I think VUCA is the word which is absolutely made for Middle East in that sense, right? Crazy
Okay. So
swings,
this,
Ramadan, this, that, geopolitical, it
yes.
just goes on and on. Sorry, please carry on.
No, I was going to say, so this kind of leads into like the next question. I think you've worked on a lot of multinational companies, and sometimes people want to like, and you actually posted about this on LinkedIn. You had a post about this where people try and kind of copy and paste maybe what worked in Europe or maybe even the US, and they're like, I'm just going to apply it to this Middle East region. But it is astonishing. Like if 85% of what you consume is all imported, it could be impacted by kind of like anything and everything that's going on in the world. So from a leadership standpoint, like how do you guide some of these executive teams to maybe leave that Western mindset, this distributor first mindset behind and truly build like a localized fit for purpose supply chain?
Yeah, no, it is definitely a challenge. And I can tell you that when I joined started my first role in J&J, there were people who did not understand Middle East, and they did not know that Middle East is actually a bunch of 17 different countries. I had to actually, probably give geography lessons in some specific instances, saying that, these are 17 different countries and these are different governments, and, different regulators. And they don't think the same, and you cannot have all of them same. So Middle East has so much diversity within itself. So for example, if you were to look at Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Qatar, and UAE, right? These are one, very premium markets, high growth, this thing, premium markets. And then there is the Levant countries, which we look at, Lebanon, Jordan, sometimes even Palestine, Pakistan, Egypt. Very different. They behave very differently from each other. So it's very, very you can't really treat them as the same. So it's constantly kind of, so it actually has the what should I say? It actually combines developed world economies with emerging markets complexities. So it's actually
It
a
is.
mix
It's
of both.
so complex. Yeah.
It is. So, when it's a couple of things that I kind of focus on, and, it's usually a step-by-step approach. So the first thing is, of course, to build awareness. And as I said, the geography lesson kind of comes across that, talk about the geopolitical history, the mix between developed and, developing countries and so on and so forth. The second thing that I do is a lot of times I invite these global stakeholders to be part of our local processes. So, for example, bring them
Mm,
into the SNOPs or region, monthly or other cadence meetings that we have, just to kind of be a spectator. They don't have to participate; they just have to understand the chaos that we operate in. Imagine a $6 million order dropping by overnight without any forecast, zero forecast. It's as easy as that, right? Nobody. I mean, in Europe, even if you were to do that, I would get a heart attack. How can you operate? How can you think of shopping a $6 million order and tell me, where is the forecast? Oh, I mean, nobody forecasted because it just came out of the blue. How did you not know? I mean, if we did not know, because that's how it works here. So I think making sure that they are part of some of our key processes to really understand the fragmentation, the dynamics that we kind of work with, and I think that the third is, of course, really show them that this is a lucrative business. Middle East started
mm,
as an outpost. That's how it you know. So, I mean, people just operated with through distributors. Here, they give everything to a distributor. You do everything. You have my market. You manage my brand. You manage my channel. You manage everything. And then Saudi opened up and UAE started growing, and then all of a sudden you realize that this is a lucrative market. There is a lot of money. There are good
mhm.
margins. It behaves like Europe in many ways, but it is not Europe,
Yeah.
right? So,
So,
I'll tell you an instance. I was opening a new distribution center in Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is a very large country, and it took me months to convince people in Europe that we don't need one but two distribution centers in that country, not because all other countries in Europe have only one. Why do I need two in Saudi Arabia? But Saudi Arabia is not Europe, and the distances are not the same. I mean, and then there is half of the country is desert, and there is mountain, and then there's desert at in the same place. And how do you really operate that?
It's fascinating.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's yeah. I I will say I think especially coming from the US, like we think we understand like nuances from state to state, but then when I lived in Europe and you really have different government, different regulations, and that it does just add a level of complexity that I don't think a lot of people can even get their head around if you're not really in it. Because I do think you almost get a false sense. Because to your point, when you visit or go to offices, you think you understand it until you actually have to immerse in it and live
Yeah,
in it and work in it every day. I
yeah.
do think it makes a huge difference. Okay, so Himani, you drove major transformation for a global cosmetic retailer that achieved 11% inventory drawdown alongside a 15% surge in click to possess metrics. So, can you just pull the curtain back on some of the technical changes, whether in warehousing, fulfillment, or 3PL partnerships, that allowed you to compress that delivery window, but by also leaning out stock levels, which is, I think that's the magic that we want to hear about.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, no, absolutely, Karni. So, I believe that when you look at transformation, you can't just look at it from the point of view of infrastructure, right? The infrastructure and the processes and the systems, they all have to kind of go along with each other. So when we were looking at this opportunity, and this is a project that we were doing as a part of my consulting assignment, I think there were two or three things that kind of really stood out for us. One was, of course, how do we really reduce inventory? They were operating with a very large amount of inventory, and a lot of that was actually managed by inbound aggregation. So there was a lot of fragmentation which was there from the supplier point of view. They were actually taking lots of deliveries directly into stores from almost 50% of their suppliers. So bringing that all of those deliveries into a distribution hub and then making sure that the single delivery is going to each of the stores really
Mhm.
helped that quite substantially. Uh, the other thing was really, implementing what we call as multi-echelon inventory systems, where you actually hold a much higher level of inventory upstream in the regional and national DCs and much lesser down the line. So in this particular case, it was the storefront, and some all of these cosmetic stores are in expensive mall spaces. So being able to reduce
Mhm.
that space in any of those areas was very, very lucrative, because instead of holding, let's say, 15 days of inventory. Now you're sitting on 3 to 5 days of inventory for most of it. Whereas, you kind of have that inventory in the regional and the national DCs. And the third piece was around bringing a new national distribution center. And in this particular case, it was for Saudi Arabia, where we actually set up a new distribution center, which changed the replenishment frequency. We were replenishing the stores once in a month, and we moved to once a week, sometimes even twice a week for A category products as well as A category stores. And replenishment speed. When we were actually moving it from a regional distribution center directly to storefront, the lead time was almost 30 days. And when we moved to a national distribution center, this lead time got reduced to 2 days.
Oh,
That's amazing.
Yeah. So, when you look at that, so infrastructure combined with the processes, then you bring that together and then you say, okay, this is how I'm going to deploy my inventory. I think that's where the magic happens.
Monty, how long did it take to get that executed and implemented?
It's still in execution. I would say about 1.5 years.
Okay, that was my guess.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, 12 to 18 months minimum. Just setting up the distribution center itself is a 12-month thing. And,
Yeah.
then the rest would typically follow.
so this next question kind of ties into process. Again, I love your experience across so many different industries. So this one is when you were in healthcare, you successfully boosted stock availability from like 65% to 85%, and you did it through SNOP.
Yes.
And really setting up that structure and that governance. And I think a lot of times we hear about technology and all these other things, but a lot of times it comes back to the process and people first. And I think about healthcare, and you want to have like near perfect availability, right? Because this, like, people are really counting on this. So what were some of the things that you learned as you went through that? How did you design like a demand planning governance framework that could also, like we all know, things happen, right? It's a volatile world. So how did you stand up that structure, get people involved? And then two, like, did you have to think about something different? Because I just think about that from a healthcare standpoint versus, having shampoo on the shelf versus
Very
having
different.
medicine in people's hands. That feels different.
Yeah, absolutely, Katie. In fact, in this particular case, when we say healthcare, it's not even medicines; it's actually surgical products. So they actually end up getting
Yeah.
into a surgery. So yes, I think it definitely does become very critical, and I can tell you that it took me quite a bit of time to really wrap my head around it, to really understand how it is. And there were a couple of things that kind of fell in place. The first thing that we understood was that, especially in this region where we operate in the Middle East, healthcare is largely a government thing. Right, there's very little private volumes which are kind of coming into the market. It's a very, very government-driven, government-funded activity for bulk of the spend that you see in the region. So really understand how the governments think and operate is a very big part of managing healthcare in this region. Now, when I was in India, this was not necessarily the case. It was there. Governments in all the countries buy a lot of healthcare products, like surgical products for the hospitals that they manage, and so on and so forth. But in this particular case, I would say a big chunk, I would say in excess of 60% is actually government funded. So that is quite large. So you really need to see the buying behavior. So what happens when governments buy? They typically do tenders, right? When they do tenders, and these tenders usually have long lead time in terms of getting, the tenders getting processed. And once they actually get awarded, then they have usually a life cycle of 2 to 3 years, and they have a certain way in which they operate. So once I got a hang of that, then things became much easier. And we did not have this what we call as the market intelligence process to really bring this into our demand planning process. We used to be very, very reactive. Every time a tender would drop, we would run and huff and puff and somehow manage to activate that tender and give that some amount of stock. Sometimes we would give, sometimes we would not be able to give. We would end up getting a lot of penalties also because of this. Sometimes we would give late. So all of those things. So bringing a process around this entire tendering thing, which is unpredictable because you don't know if you land the tender or not. But if you do land the tender, then you need to respond in a very short span of time, because it's a government tender. So if you don't do it, then the penalties could be very, very substantial.
Yes, they're extreme.
Yeah. And so, really keeping track of each and every tender and really seeing what is the life cycle of that tender and how it is operating and where it is going and what are our chances of kind of getting close to it and getting awarded. that was one big framework or market intelligence process that kind of we built. Now when you execute this process, you typically get into the typical challenges of the sales team wants to keep the information to themselves because they feel that if you don't land the tender, then they will be held accountable for XYZ, excess inventory, or so many other things that you put this thing. And that's where I actually embedded my team members into the commercial team's monthly,
Mm.
weekly cadence. And I told my team members that you're first of the franchise and then of supply chain, and not the other way around. You have to really think, eat, live, that business that you're operating with. Demand planners kind of get deeply embedded into the business. And lots of organizations constantly struggle with should demand planning sit in supply chain, should demand planning should sit in commercial. Frankly, it's not really big deal as long as they're well embedded into the business and they really understand how do they bring that.
Yeah.
So that trust needs to be built. That's an important part. So, I really embedded my team into each one of them, and that helped us bring a lot of information on board that we didn't have earlier, or we couldn't have acted on. Even if it was there, people were reluctant to share it because they were like, "What if it doesn't land? How do we really
Mhm.
manage it?" And so it goes a lot around how as humans we think and operate and behave. And I think the third is about, how do you position your inventory to be able to be responsive to each one of these?
Mm, yeah.
Right. So you have a process, you embedded your team, and now you need to see how do you execute it if that tender lands, and if it doesn't land, how do you not land up with a heap of inventory that you don't want?
Yeah.
So that positioning of inventory and making sure that it is positioned in a manner and routinely refreshed because you also have a shelf life to deal with
Yep.
was the other big part of it in terms of really making sure that the execution kind of works well. So we actually placed inventory upstream in the regional global distribution centers so that it was kind of kept for us, but if we didn't get it, then it was available to the lot. And these were like A and B class SKUs which could have actually gone to everybody. For C and D class SKUs, we actually built not the product inventory but the raw material and packaging material inventory so that we could
Mm.
convert them really fast. And they usually have a long tail. And then we position some inventory closer home in the distribution centers close by to really be able to respond to at least the emergency needs of the tenders. Because, while tenders have certain needs, they usually have long lead time. So there's certain things which are like needed immediately, and then for the rest, they're okay to wait. So positioning of that inventory across supply chain and constantly refreshing that was another big part of that.
Yeah, there's so much I like in your answer. I think one, I don't know if we always do enough of the segmentation by SKUs and tiers, and
I was thinking
so
that as soon as you were talking
oh my
through all
gosh,
that, I
because
was
I
like,
feel like we
ooh,
try to
self-reflection right now.
oh my gosh, I was like, we do, and then we end up ending up with way too much. I also like the embedding your team in the commercial with the commercial team in that mindset, to like, I just I think we do that in pockets, but I also think when we do that, sometimes you get Katie and I both been in business supply chain roles where you're trying to be the mediator between keeping nobody happy sometimes. So I
Yeah, it's a
think
tightrope. I
everyone's
can
never happy
understand
with
that.
you.
It's a tightrope walk. Absolutely.
So I love that mindset and how to get people to think. Because I always tell people at the end of the day, like we are a supply chain, but we need business to actually we need something to move and to transform. So we do have to be business leaders and thinkers. I love that you shared that. Okay, so I did want to talk about your transition to consulting. So you spent over 2 decades kind of in-house corporate supply chains for major multinational companies, and now you're a management consultant. So how has your approach to problem solving shifted now that you're looking from the supply chain from like outside in? And what's a corporate blind spot that you think leaders are missing?
So thank you so much. I think very interesting question. I can tell you that it's changed quite a lot, I must admit, and I did not expect that to happen when I started my consulting stint, but it has changed quite a bit. I think, when we are inside an organization, we are so busy with our operational responsibilities, the day-to-day aspect of it, that we give very relatively smaller time of our, role into transformation, and if at all, many times we don't even do that. And when we do it, we don't really have a clear framework of how do we go about it. We would say, okay, there's an opportunity. Let me see, we work through it and, kind of that. I think now, what consulting has done, it's really strengthened my ability to diagnose very, very quickly. I can get into the organization, I can look at some high level data and maybe interview a couple of people, and I can tell you in 3 days where the actual problem sits.
Oh,
Establish
Why do you
facts.
think we can't see that, Hermione?
Sorry?
and
Like,
what
why
questions are you asking that
why do
we
you
should
think
be
that, like, we
asking?
can't see the problem?
Because we are so involved. We are
Yeah.
a part of the system, so it's difficult. That's why they say fresh eyes, fresh perspective, things like that. So we do that. We can quantify value, build roadmaps, a lot of things that I would not give that much importance to. Because as consultants, our first objective is to drive value, right? We show the impact. And if you don't do this very, very quickly, then it just becomes a part of the process. And nobody pays for process, I can tell you that.
Mm,
Everybody pays for the impact or the value that you bring. You
mhm,
could say, okay, I'll come and set your SNOP, but if you say, okay, I'll set SNOP and I'll improve your availability from X to Y and that will
mhm,
improve your revenues from Y to Z, that is what they're interested in. They're not bothered about
mm,
how you generate market intelligence or do any of those things.
The impact. It's funny. Uh, there's a leader, and one of the things that she always talks about is, and it's kind of like, how do you get in that consultant mindset and like kind of take yourself out of it because you are so in it deeply, and people care and they think they're doing the right thing. But she frames it up as if like the next kind of hot shot was coming in behind me and I
mhm,
was having to like transition this desk to that person, what would they see? Like
mm,
truly, what would they see and kind of come in and want to fix? And it like kind of clarifies for
mm.
her, what are my
Yeah,
big priorities
Yeah,
that I need to
yeah,
get
no, I
after?
think that's
Yeah,
a
yeah.
great
I like
point.
that.
Right. Let me come to the second part of the question, which is around blind spots or maybe things that we don't really
Mhm,
focus too much on when we are doing the job. A couple of them, I think. I think the first is the underinvestment in quality of data and data governance. I can't tell you
mm,
number of companies I have walked into who have problems into their master data, duplicate records, incorrect data in master data. And in the age of AI, this is the bare minimum that we need to do to just even use that, right?
mm,
How do you really do anything? But that does happen more often than what we would like to. And I'm not talking about big multinationals, because big multinationals typically have SAP and HANA, S4HANA, and everything else that they want to talk about. But generally, the middle segment, they really struggle with some of these. So we do a lot of work with local companies here, and many of them struggle with the data quality and governance. I think the other is too much focus on accuracy and not enough on responsiveness. So
mm,
we
Hmm.
would spend hundreds and thousands and millions of dollars to put tools and improve our forecast accuracy from 80% to 85% to 87%, but very little on building that responsiveness in my supply chain by having an alternate supplier,
mm,
making sure that I have an alternate route if Suez Canal shuts down, making sure that I'm doing all of those things to prepare myself. And I can tell you that, in February, when we had our biggest port shut down, everybody got a root shock. Everybody had a BCP on the table and none of it worked.
mm.
None of it. Because there was not enough investment and effort that has gone into it.
Yeah.
And we learned it, real time. I mean, I
That
hope
might
the
be the
rest of
biggest
the
aha of the episode for me, that one.
So,
Yeah, okay.
we did, bring together some of the industry leaders, and everybody was saying the same thing. Some people said, okay, we had no BCP. Okay, great. But I had the BCP, but I had not tested it out. I had the BCP, I had tested it out, but I did not know that my BCP will get tested out with a million other BCPs at the same time.
That's a good point, yeah.
So everybody's testing, executing their BCP at the same time. So, what do you really do?
I like it. Okay. One of the things that you talk a lot about is having a future ready supply chain. And, AI feels like it's constantly changing. What is going on in the world, you never know. Like literally day by day, you don't know what's going to pop and what's going to happen. Sustainability continues to evolve. So when you say a future ready supply chain infrastructure, like what does that look like? And initially I was going to ask like, what does that look like by the end of the decade? But that might just be even too far out.
Yeah, I know.
But what does a future ready, like what do you need to be thinking about and putting in place if you want to make your supply chain future ready? Like what does that look like to you?
So I would say future ready supply chain has to follow I mean, I wouldn't say I would focus too much on automation here, right? Because for me it's always the tripod, the people, process, and systems that have to kind of stand together.
Yep.
Any one of them, you could have the best AI supply chain tools, but if you don't have the talent to run it or the processes to maturity to withstand it, it's not of any use. And I can tell you that I have seen so many people buying the Blue Yonder Ferrari and then keeping it on the side and doing Excel sheet planning day in and day out. It is phenomenal. Number of instances I've seen that. It's just it's shocking actually, but that's a fact. So I think what I would say is that the technology has to follow the operating model, and we constantly focus on operating model in consulting, and I think that's a really important part of it. What is my operating model, and where does technology really fit in? So I think a future-ready supply chain would be more visible. Has to be more visible. The number of companies that do not use sellout data to manage their demand planning is not funny because they don't know how to do it. They don't have the visibility. So it definitely has to be more visible, right? What are you doing in the retails? What is your vendor doing? What is your vendor's vendor doing? I don't have any visibility. So it has to be more visible, definitely. It has to be AI enabled. And I don't think any of us can walk away from that. It is not AI dependent, but it has to be AI enabled, in some way or the other. And it, again, operating model decides what you use, where you use it, how do you use it, and where do you complement that with human skills, and so on and so forth. And while everybody says that demand planning is a great way to do it, I can tell you that there are lots of skills of a demand planner that AI will never be able to really, connect those dots. The things that you get with that learned experience on constant incorrects that you have done in the mistakes that you've made, and the learned
Yeah.
experience is very different from getting it from. So I think AI will definitely not be able to do it. I think the other thing is that the future supply chains will be more create more optionality. They'll be more resourceful. There'll be more, lack of a better analogy, there'll be more women, be more feminine. Women are so resourceful. If you don't have this, you have that. If you don't have that, let's do this. There's always options that we have, right? And I think future supply chains will be more feminine.
Okay, so since you said that, your profile proudly features Women in Supply Chain India. So could you share a little bit more about that organization and then really talk about like what changes are you seeing today in attracting female talent to some of these core supply chain roles and what work still needs to happen?
Right. So, I set up Women in Supply Chain India. It was more like a community. For first 15 years of my life, I was the only supply chain. I was the only woman in supply chain flow. There was nobody else. I was the only one, and there were no role models. There were no people to talk to. And I'm not saying I missed it because I did not know something like this could be there. Um, when I started seeing more women in supply chain, it was one of those things that, would happen in due course. But when I look at these young women who are, now getting into supply chain or choosing supply chain as a career, I thought this is a great opportunity for me to be able to offer to them that platform or that community that many of us missed, in early years, especially from when I look at the Indian context. Katie, I don't know how much you know about it, but in India today, most of the companies would have somewhere between 10 to 11% women in their supply chain functions. And that's a high number, okay? Most of them would have none. Even very large corporations would have none. Some would have maybe two or three, here and there. Best could be 11, 12, Some companies have done really great work and moved to 35, 40%, but they'll be like maybe one or two. So there is huge ground to be covered. And I think this is a place where the idea was to actually bring them together, offer them role models, offer them, all of that support that they would many times not be able to get on their own, organizations. So I think that's one. What changes I'm seeing? I'm definitely seeing more women in supply chain, but it's nowhere close to what could have been or what should have been. So I think remote working, flexible working that COVID brought was great. We're taking a bit of step back on that, so it's a bit of sad situation to be in. But it's improving, I would say, but nowhere where it should be. We'll get there.
But I just
Well,
say, I just think it's amazing that you started that organization, even though you said you didn't have that, but reaching back and providing that platform and space for women is amazing. And we've heard so much from Priya about you. So just that's such a great just
Thank
thing
you.
for you to
Thank you
do.
so
And
much. Thanks.
I just hear all of the humility and just bravery that you've had through your career. It's quite amazing. And thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. My pleasure.
All right.
Money, this has been So good. Like
Okay.
such
So
a great
good.
conversation. I've learned so much and you have worked in so many different places. I have so many good notes here too.
No, thank you so much. Thanks. It's a lot of it happened more by default than by design, I can say.
Well, we've been so happy to have you this morning for us, early morning, and probably
Thank you
late
so much
evening
for
for you. So
having me.
thank you so
Yes.
much, Himani, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks a lot.